I have to admit, after wishing you a Shavua Tov, that I feel a little bit uncomfortable in this Zoom setting here because I don't see anybody right now. And if anyone could help me, all you have to do is turn on your camera. Oh, okay, great. That's very helpful. Because I didn't recognize the name here. We'll continue with our overview of Kodshim. And we're discussing the concept of Ritzui Tzitz in the case of a carbon that contracted Tumah. And when we talk about a carbon Tameh, we can subdivide it into two categories. We can talk about the Emurim, which require Haktar al Gabi Mizbeach, which we can't do B'tumah unless we hold Tzitz Maratza. And we spoke about Tzitz Maratza in the case of a carbon Tzibur. And then we can talk about the basa that has to be Nechal li Adam, not in the case of an Ola, but in a case of a Chatas V'yasham, which is Nechal l'Kohanim, or in a case of Shlomim, which is Nechal not just Kohanim, but l'Bailim. Now the question is the following. When we have Ritzui Tzitz, that's going to help us not only with regard to Tumah in the carbon, but even with regard to Tumah in the Kohanim. Let's say, for example, we have, the Kohanim are divided up into Mishmaros, and in this particular Mishmar of Kohanim that's on duty today, we cannot locate a Kohen who's tar. But we said that, at least as far as a carbon Tzibur is concerned, we have to study carbon Yachid, but a carbon Tzibur, we're going to say that the Torah is Matir Tumah for a carbon through the mechanism, the conduit of the magical tzitz. Now we have another question. Does that come under what's called Tumah Putra B'tzibur or Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur? Now it could be that Tumah Putra B'tzibur would mean that I don't even need tzitz. But the nafkamina between Hutra and Dechuya is the following. The Kohanim are Tmeim. Should we extend ourselves with a great effort, the Tirchi Yisera, and seek out other Kohanim that might belong to a different Mishmar, and we're going to pull them in to replace these Kohanim who are Tmeim. That's called Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur. Because if we use the Kohanim Tmeim for the purpose of this carbon, they will not be able to eat the basa. Whereas if we bring Kohanim Tahorim to replace them, then in addition to the Akravas HaKarbon, which we could have achieved even with the Kohanim Tmeim because of the principle of Tumah B'tzibur, but we will have to forfeit the Achila, because even if you operate within the framework of Ritzui Tzitz, that's not going to help us to allow a Tameh to eat Basar Kodesh. And that motivates us to want to bring in a substitute Kohen, who in this case is a Kohen Tar, to replace the Kohen Tameh, and thereby facilitate the Achilas HaBasar Yidei Kohen Tar. he says the following: if I hold Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, I don't need to seek out a Kohen Tar who belongs to a different Mishmeres, or might even belong to a different base Av, in a situation where all the Mishmaros in one particular base Av are Tmeim. However, that only applies to, let's say, a Korban Olah, where if we go ahead and push forward with Kohen and Tmeim, we're not going to forfeit the mitzvah of Achilas Habasa, because there is no Achilas Habasa. But when we get to a Korban Chatas or a Korban Oshem, and how much more so a Korban Shlomim, then all right, Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, as far as the Akrav is concerned, go full forward without hesitation to be makriv the Korban, but realize the drawback here is that you're forfeiting the Achilas Habasa, because the Kohen Tomei cannot eat the Basa B'tumah. Therefore, the Korbanos HaNecholim, Afilu Leman Diomar Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, Tzorech Lechapes Achar Kohen Tar. We're going to go to another base Av if need be, to replace these Kohanim that are contracted Tumah, in order to facilitate the mitzvah of Achilas Basar HaKodshim. Mishum Sha'af Shehutra Tumah B'tzibur, we cannot allow the Kohanim Tmeim to eat the basa. Tzitz Maratza is as far as that which goes on the Mizbeach, but as far as which has to do with Achilas Adam, there the tzitz is not going to make a dent. It's not going to permit Achilas Kodshim to a Kohen Tameh. And therefore we're going to have to forfeit, if we hold Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, the Kiyum mitzvah of Achilas Habas? The answer is no. Even if Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, if the Kohanim in this Mishmeres are Tmeim, we're going to have to stretch our arm out to a different Mishmeres or a different Beis Av in order to guarantee the Achilas Habasa. Shekarban Atameh, meaning it's craven B'tumah through Kohanim Tmeim, Ein B'saram Necha. The Kohanim cannot eat the basa because they're Tmeim. B'tzarech l'shtadel l'kayim es mitzvahs achilas hakorban, and therefore we're going to try to draft a Kohen Tar to replace the Kohen Tar. And this is a sugya in Masechta Yoma on Daf Zayin. Now, until now, we've discussed the concept of either Dechuya B'tzibur or Tumah Hutra B'tzibur with regard to Tumas Mes. What about Tumas Sheretz? Very often, we in Taros we accept an equation between Tumas Sheretz and Tumas Mes. What if the Kohen is Tomei, not Tumas Mes, but Tumas Sheretz? And here we have a Shita Mekubetzes in explaining Rashi in Zvachim Daf Chav Beis, and he holds a Tumas Sheretz of a Kohen Nidches B'Korban Tzibur, meaning just like with Doche Tumas Mes B'Tzibur, so too we can be Doche Tumas Sheretz. So whether the Kohen contracted Tumas Mes or Tumas Sheretz, we can apply the principle of Dechuya or Hutra in a case of a Korban Tzibur, and the Kohen who is Tameh because he came in contact with the dead sheretz is going to do the avodah. That's the Shita Megubetzes in the name of Rashi. The Rambam disagrees. He's probably not even aware of the Shita Megubetzes or the Rashi. And he paskins in the 4th chapter of Bias Migdash, Shalom Nema Din Techias Tumah B'Tzibur, Ela B'Tumas Mes Bilvad. The entire enterprise, the halachic principle of Tumah B'Tzibur, in the case of a carbon tzibur, whether you call it Techia or Hutra is irrelevant, only applies to a Kohen who is Tamei Tumas Mes. That's the context in which we derive the principle, and that's the context where we limit the principle of Tumah Techia B'Tzibur. The Lo B'Shar Tumas. People ask the question whether Tumas Mes is more chomer than other tumas or less chomer than other tumas. Here we're learning that Tumas Mes is on a lower echelon than other tumas. Keep that in mind. If we ever, because when we finish our project in Kodshim, I'd like to move on to Taros. Again, no commitments here, no nidarim here. But when we get to Taros, we're going to try to find a hierarchy of tumas, like a pyramid. And we're going to put Tumas Mes on the bottom of the pyramid, which is a bit of a chiddush because there are many chidushim in Tumas Mes that don't apply to other tumas. Like, for example, the status of Tumas Mes is an Ava Tuma, which makes Mes into an Avia Vosatum, which is an exception to the rule. It's Matami Odav Kalim. But nevertheless, with regard to the principle of being matir, a havas karban bituma, Tumas Mes becomes the most lenient of all tumas. And the Rambam says, even if you move 1 inch away from Tumas Mes into Tumas Sheretz, we're not going to apply the kula of the Chuya B'Tzibur. But the Shita Megubetzes in Rashi learns that Tumas Sheretz and Tumas Mes have the identical status, and we're going to apply Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur even if the Kohen contracted a Tumah Sheretz. Let's move on to other categories of Tumah, and whether or not we would apply the principle of Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur for the sake of even though the Kohen is Tameh. Let's talk about a Zav. The Kohen was a Zav. He had 3 re'ils consecutively of Ziva, and Nitma Kohen B'Tumah Ziva. In this case, everyone agrees that the Kohen could not do the Avodah, even in the case of a Korban Tzibur, and we don't apply the principle of Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. We're going to limit that principle to Tumas Mes, perhaps expanded to Tumah Sheretz, but on a higher level of what's called Tumah Yotzes Migufo. Keep in mind that both in the case of Mes and Sheretz, there was a contact between the Kohen and the Tumah. There was nothing internal inside the body of the Kohen that generated Tumah, as opposed to Tumah Ziva, which puts that status of Tumah on a higher level of the echelon of Tumah because it's Tumah Yotzes Migufo, and therefore there's no application of the principle of Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. So Nitches HaTumah B'Tzibur B'Tumah Yotzes Migufo. I didn't see it. I think I cheated. I didn't see it. V'chein im hayu hakohanim mitzoraim lo nitches lahem tumah. Mitzora is also called Tumah Yotzes Migufo, even though, again, there's no ziva of anything that flows from his body. But since there's a phenomenon of tzaras, baheres and so forth on his body, it's equivalent to Tumah Hayotzes Migufo, and there's no permission that's granted for such a Kohen, even in the case of a Kohen Tzibur, to do the Avodah. We do not apply the principle of Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. Now we get to the following question. What happens if nitnu abaylim? Now, if nitnu abaylim, then l'chorah we would say the baylim are not involved in the avoda in any shape or form. Why should we be inhibited? Why should it be even a havamina that the laws of tuma dechuya would apply if the baylim became tumah? And here we have a sugya in Psachim. So we're moving from Yuma to Psachim. That's Machadesh. That the only reason we could go ahead with the avodah in a case where the where the Bailim contracted tumah, is because of Shiluach HaKarban, meaning the Bailim, even though they're considered to be the ones who are bringing the Karban, but since they could appoint the Kohen as their agent, so to speak, to do the avoda of the Karban, therefore the fact that the Bailim are Tmeim should not exclude the Hakrava, because the Hakrava is being implemented by their agents, the Kohen. However, that's true in the case of Nitnu Abaylam B'Tumas Sheretz or Nitnu Abaylam B'Tumas Mes, Makrivim Aleim Karbonos. The Kohanim could serve as their upfront agents, even though they're operating on behalf of the Bailim. But the answer is because the Bailim contracted a lower echelon Tumah V'Tara, namely Tumas Sheretz, or possibly even in the case of Tumas Mes, we're going to view that as a lower echelon Tumah, and we're going to rely on the Kohanim to implement the Avodah on behalf of the Bailim. Nitmu Abaylim B'Tuva Ziva, which we said was higher on the hierarchy, it's Tumah Yotzis Migufo of Tmeir. He quotes now in the footnote Tovchav Tosus Shita, Eino Mevi Karbanos. No shlichus is going to help over here. We cannot operate on behalf of a Bailim who are Tameh, or who is Tameh, Tumas Ziva, and Mitzorah. And the same thing applies to Mitzorah. So it's really fascinating. We normally have a principle of Tameh Mishalech Karbanosov. Person is Tameh, so he can't bring the carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. Let someone else do the work for him. But in the case of Tumas Ziva, and for that matter, Tumas Mitzorah, we're not going to rely on the normal principle of Mishalech Karbanos, that you can send the Shliach. Once you've contracted this Tumah Chamura, the Shliach is operating on your behalf, and we don't bring a Karban in that state of Tumah of Ziva or Tzaras. If on the other hand,
Rav Berza?
yeah,
I was just saying, is this the principle of Shlichuto Sheben Adam Kamoto?
correct.
So if I owned chametz and I had a shliach to send to deal with the Korban Pesach, that wouldn't work because I own chametz. Is that the same idea?
Let me remind myself for a minute of the sugyas in Psachim. It's an Easter of Shchitas HaPesach when there's chametz in the Azara. What happens in case Bailim, they had would have to learn again. That's a sugya psachim. I don't have access to Gemara psachim, nor do I have the time right now to learn that sugya. But let's just say the following: that in general, can a person send a shliach and have the carbon brought on his behalf? Forget about chametz for a minute. I think that's a more complicated sugya psachim. But just fundamentally, I mean, a man is tameh. Can the carbon be brought on his behalf? Can he be mishalech karbonosav al yidei acher? And we're saying the following: that if he has a lower echelon tumah, such that tumah dechuya b'tzibur, which means he's tameh either tumas mes or perhaps even tumas sheretz, then yes, we'll bring the carbon on his behalf. And we're using as our yardstick the law and the principle of Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. If Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur applies when a Kohen has contracted Tumas Mes or Sheretz, and we're going to allow for that Kohen to do the Avodah, that's going to prove to me that within the context of relating Tumah to Carbon, these two categories of Tumah are lower echelon, and we're going to go ahead and allow the Kohen in that state of Tumah to do the Avodah. Now we shift our focus to a different issue, and that is the Bailam contracted Tumah. They want to send the carbon with someone else, ask Yankala to bring the carbon to the Mizbeach on his behalf. He's Tameh. And we're going to say that no. If he's Tameh a Tumah Kala, again, I'm using that word as a borrowed term, it's a lower severity of Tumah because it's that type of Tumah where the Kohen himself would do the Avodah if it was a carbon Sibur, even though he contracted Tumas Mes or Tumas Sheretz. Then, having defined it as a lower echelon Tumah, we're going to allow bringing the carbon on behalf of that Bailim who has contracted those lower echelon Tumahs. But if, on the other hand, the Bailim is Tami Tumas Sav, or for that matter, Tumas Mitzora, and that's called the Tumah Yotzis Migufo, it's a more severe contamination, if you call it that, requires bidud. So then we're going to say that he can send a shliach to bring his carbon on his behalf. No, I'm sorry. That he cannot send a shliach to bring the carbon on his behalf. Because in that case, we have no matir, there's no leniency in the essential tumah. And therefore, we're going to say shlucho shalom kimoso, and the carbon is being brought on his behalf. That's a carbon b'tumah. And now we're talking about a tumah, a carbon nachid, because a carbon sibur, we wouldn't get into this whole issue about sending your carbon, with the shliach. He makes another point here that even if technically he could send his carbon because his tumah is only that of tumas mes, for example, nevertheless, l'chatchila, we would want to delay bringing his carbon until after he was mitayr himself. That's l'chatchila. Kidei sheyuchal l'kayim din smicha b'carbon. What do we gain over here? After all we need is ritzui carbon, that the carbon should be brought and kosher and it should be machaper, and we can do that even without waiting until he's mitayr himself. But the answer is we do want his the violent's personal involvement in the hakravas carbon, not to do the avoda, obviously, he's not a kohen, but to do what's called smicha b'karbonos. He enters into the azara and he leans on the head of the carbon, recites vidui, and we bring the carbon on his behalf. All that has to be cut out in a case where the bailim are tmeim tumas mes. They cannot enter the azara. They cannot do smicha on the carbon. Let's wait until they could be mitayadim. They lekayim din smicha bekorban. So again, I would say that smicha now is a chovas gavra. It's not part of the actual hakrava. As far as the hakrava is concerned, we have no compunctions or hesitations about bringing the korban, even though the bailam is a tabei mess. What we've established, though, is that the bailam have an obligation within the context of the hakrava, and that's called smicha, and therefore we would want to wait in dini karbanos in order to facilitate the kiyum gavra of smicha. For example, a woman might be able to bring a korban without smicha. We have cases where we bring a korban without smicha. This would be a case where we bring the korban without smicha, but it is a chiyuv smicha, albeit it's in the background, meaning it's locked up behind the tumah of tumas mess, but nevertheless the gavra, insofar as he's bringing a korban through a shliach, he's chayav in smicha, and we want to make sure, if possible, that he can be makayim in the midst of smicha.
Rabbi Berzon?
Yeah.
If smicha is mandatory and for some reason it's forgotten, is it ma'akev? Everything else is there's no.
No, it's not ma'akev the korban. It's a separate chomas gavra. Okay. Now we get to a more complicated case. If life wasn't complicated enough, and he calls it miktsas hatzibur. Okay. Nitvu rov hatzibur b'tumas mes. Most of the tzibur is tamei b'tumas mes. Again, if it was a tumas ziba, so then in general we cannot bring the korban. Yeah, but that's only in a korban yochid. 1 second. Again, if the bailam on tummy tumas ziba, we cannot bring the korban. But now we're talking about nitma rov hatzibur. I'm just going to read this through and see if we can make sense out of it. Last time I read it, I didn't understand it. Maybe today we'll have better luck. And I left it with a question mark. See, I'm just not sure what the status of the korban Pesach is. Every korban that's a korban yochid is brought by an individual. But Pesach is a little bit different. I mean, the entire community of Israel could be Yotzei with one korban Pesach. I mean, you need minui. But again, I'm not going into the nitty-gritty details. but the status of a Korban Pesach is a little different than a classic Korban Yachid. So in the case of a Korban Yachid, let's say the Bailim were Tmeim Tumas Ziva, we said clearly the Korban cannot be brought on behalf, excuse me for a second, on behalf of a Zah, because that's already a Tumah Chamur. We can bring the Korban on behalf of a Tamei Metz. But the halacha becomes more complicated if the Korban Pesach is being brought, let's say, on behalf of a tzibur, and now the Korban Pesach takes on a status of a Korban tzibur. So what happens? We're going to bring a Korban tzibur b'tumah, even if rov hatzibur atmein. And how does this halacha change over here? We said you don't bring a korban on behalf of Zah. What happens, for example, if most of the tzibur are participating in one single korban Pesach, and they're all Tamei b'tumas Zah? And for that matter, what would be if they're all Tamei b'tumas Metz? So if you're telling me that despite the fact that rov hatzibur are tmeim tumas Metz, nevertheless, we're going to bring the korban Pesach. So then we're upgrading the korban Pesach to the status of a korban tzibur. And we said that in a korban tzibur, tumas Mes lends itself to dechiyah, possibly even to hutra. So clearly I can go ahead and be makriv a korban Pesach on behalf of a tzibur. Again, I don't know exactly what that tzibur is, who they're made up of, but rov of them are tmeim tumas Mes. But what happens in a case where most of them are tmeim tumas Zah? So in this section here, he goes through various scenarios of different kinds of tumah as far as the korban Pesach is concerned. Can we bring the korban Pesach? So again, I'm going to skip the first case because that's the most complicated case, but nitru b'tumas Mes, so what would you have said if it wasn't a korban Pesach? Had it not been a korban Pesach and it was tumas Mes, we said that we would bring the korban on his behalf. But in korban Pesach, the law becomes so much more complicated because the whole essence of a korban Pesach is to allow achila. In the constellation of korbanos, Pesach is unique. The Torah says, "V'yochel es habasar b'layla hazeh," and if there's no possibility of eating the basar, then the korban is meaningless. So how can we go ahead and bring the korban if even part of the tzibur are tmeim tumas Mes? They won't be able to eat the korban. And in the case of korban Pesach, without the achila, we are completely lost. And if that be the case, then we have to disqualify korban Pesach, even in those cases where vis-a-vis other korbanos, if it was a korban yachid we would bring the carbon on behalf of the Tomei, like, for example, Tomei Mes, maybe even Tomei Sheretz, but we can't allow that in the case of a carbon Pesach, unless we can apply a principle of Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, if Rov HaTzibur Atmeim Tumas Mes or Tumas Sheretz, and we're going to allow them to eat from the basket, which we've never seen before. So Nitbu Abaylim, let's say, for example, the Bailim, in the case of a carbon Pesach with Tmeim Tumas Sheretz, then we're not sure, but let's go according to at least one school of thought would have it, that Ein Makrivim Aleim Makar, we can't bring the carbon Pesach on behalf of them. It's not a case of Rov Tzibur Tmeim. And for that matter, Nitbu Betumas Mes, or Betumas Ziva, is B'Korban Pesach Ein Makrivim Aleim Karba. Why? We said that in the case of Tumas Mes, and maybe even in the case of Tumas Sheretz, we're going to allow a carbon to be brought on behalf of the Yach, because those are lower echelons Tuma, but not so in the case of carbon Pesach, because there's no Achilas Abaylim. Again, I'm adding that, but I think that's what he has in mind. But Nitvu Rov HaTzibur, now the halacha changes. If, let's say, Rov HaTzibur Tmeim B'Tumas Mes, then Nidches Lahem HaTumah. Okay, you've upgraded the status of this carbon Pesach to carbon Tzibur, let's say. But that's still not enough, because I need the Achila. And the answer is that Tuma Dechuya B'Tzibur is now going to take on a new application in a new definition with regard to the carbon Pesach. Varei Makrivim Es HaPesach, Umiachar she'akarban karev b'tuma, yecholim hatmeim, af hakohanim hatmeim. Oh, he's saying that the kohanim tmeim to do the avoda. What can I tell you? I don't know. I left it with a question mark because I think he's missing the whole point here. I don't know. I think he omitted the main punchline. How can I say that? But he should have said that. Forget about the Kohanim doing the avodah, b'tuma. Okay, that's big. But he should have mentioned that the Bailim eat the carbon. So I don't know. I'm gonna leave this because we ran out of time for now. But B'li Neder, I'm hoping that by tomorrow I'll see if my addition here to the text is correct. Okay.